People always think the sentence that destroys a marriage has to be loud. They imagine screaming, broken dishes, or a slammed front door. They're wrong. Sometimes it arrives dressed as a joke, wrapped in a smile, and spoken into a room full of people who laugh because they think it could never happen to them. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 43 years old, born and raised in Pennsylvania, and I've spent more than half my life fixing machines most people never notice until they stop working. Conveyor systems, hydraulic presses, industrial robots, the kind of equipment that keeps factories alive while men like me quietly disappear into the background. Grease under my fingernails never bothered me. Honest work never embarrassed me. I believed a man should let his work speak louder than his mouth. My wife disagreed. The ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers that reflected light across polished marble floors. Waiters in black tuxedos floated between tables carrying champagne that cost more than the pickup truck I'd driven for nearly 12 years. Every corner of the room smelled of expensive perfume, polished wood, and the quiet confidence that comes with executive salaries. Olivia belonged here. She moved effortlessly between board members, senior executives, and investors, greeting each one with the same polished smile I'd watched her perfect over 15 years of marriage. The emerald dress she wore caught the light every time she turned, and conversations seemed to pause whenever she entered them. She had become one of the company's fastest-rising vice presidents. Everyone admired her. Everyone wanted 5 minutes of her attention. I stood near the back of the ballroom with a glass of sparkling water, wearing the only dark suit I owned. Nobody asked what I did. Nobody really cared. To them, I wasn't Ethan Walker. I was simply Olivia's husband. The blue-collar guy. The mechanic. The man who somehow ended up beside a woman destined for bigger things. I had grown used to those assumptions. Years of silence teach a man that correcting strangers rarely changes their minds. Then Chad Reynolds walked over. He was the company's chief revenue officer, younger than Olivia by a few years, perfectly tailored suit, polished shoes that had probably never touched factory dust. He wrapped one arm casually around the back of her chair and smiled at me with the confidence of someone who had never been told he wasn't the smartest person in the room. So, he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "Olivia tells us you still spend your days fixing equipment." A few people smiled politely. I nodded. "I do." He chuckled. "Well, somebody has to keep the machines running." More laughter followed. It wasn't cruel. Not yet. Olivia took a sip of wine without looking at me. Chad leaned closer. "You ever think about joining the corporate world?" I smiled. I like building things that actually work. A couple of executives exchanged glances. Someone laughed again. Chad raised his glass. "Fair enough." Then Olivia spoke. She didn't sound angry. She didn't even sound embarrassed. She sounded amused. "You know Ethan," she said, shaking her head with a small laugh, "he's comfortable where he is." She looked directly at me. "Some people are just meant to stay blue-collar." Another ripple of laughter rolled across the table. I could have ignored it. I've ignored worse. But she wasn't finished. She smiled the same smile she'd once worn on our wedding day. Then she said the sentence that quietly ended everything. "You'll never be more than a blue-collar nobody." Silence never arrives all at once. First the laughter fades. Then the music seems farther away. Then every heartbeat sounds louder than the room itself. I looked into her eyes, waiting for the familiar smile that would tell everyone she was joking. It never came. She believed every word. Around us, several executives lowered their glasses. One woman glanced toward the floor. Even Chad's grin tightened for a moment before returning, uncertain whether to laugh again. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I didn't ask her why. 15 years of marriage teaches you the difference between careless words and honest ones. Those weren't careless. Those were honest. I set my untouched glass on the nearest table. Straightened the sleeves of my jacket. Looked at Olivia one last time. Then I said quietly enough that only she could hear. I hope you're proud of what you just said. She answered with a shrug. I've only told the truth. I nodded once. Nothing more. No argument. No scene. I walked out of the ballroom while conversation slowly resumed behind me, each step echoing across the marble floor like the closing of a chapter neither of us realized had already ended. 48 hours later, the same company that applauded her confidence would ask her to stand as the board announced its unanimous decision for a new chief executive officer. The name they read wasn't the one anyone in that ballroom expected. People assume humiliation changes a man overnight. It doesn't. Most of the time, it simply confirms something he's been refusing to admit for years. Walking out of that ballroom didn't break me. It stripped away the last illusion I still wanted to believe. The night air felt cooler than it should have for late September. Downtown Chicago glowed behind me, every glass tower reflecting thousands of lights that looked beautiful from a distance and empty up close. I crossed the parking garage without rushing, listening to the echo of my own footsteps. Strange how silence can sound louder than applause. My old Ford F-250 waited exactly where I'd left it, a decade of scratches and faded paint telling stories no luxury sedan ever could. I slid into the driver's seat and rested both hands on the steering wheel without turning the key. You'll never be more than a blue-collar nobody. Her words weren't replaying in my ears anymore. They had settled somewhere deeper. The place where truth and disappointment begin to sound alike. For 15 years, I'd never asked Olivia to understand what I did. I didn't need admiration. I didn't need compliments. I only thought I had earned respect. Somewhere along the way, she'd stopped seeing the man beneath the work boots and started seeing only the boots. The engine rumbled to life, and I eased out of the garage into the city traffic. Neon lights slid across the windshield while rain from an earlier shower still clung to the pavement. Every red light gave me another excuse to think about the years behind us. When we first met, neither of us had money. She was finishing graduate school with more ambition than sleep. I was working 12-hour shifts repairing industrial equipment while taking engineering management classes at night. We'd split burgers because ordering 2 meals felt irresponsible. Our first apartment had thin walls, mismatched furniture, and a furnace that groaned louder than either of us. Back then, Olivia loved telling people I could fix anything. She'd smile whenever I came home covered in grease. She used to say those rough hands made her feel safe. Funny how success changes the vocabulary of some people. Grease eventually became embarrassment. Steel-toe boots became something to hide. The man who built things with his hands slowly became someone she introduced with an apology hidden inside a smile. I never complained. Factories taught me something boardrooms rarely do. Machines don't care about your ego. A conveyor belt doesn't run because someone has an MBA. A production line doesn't survive on polished speeches. Every system depends on people willing to solve problems nobody else wants to touch. That had always been enough for me. The following morning, my alarm rang at 5:30, exactly as it had for the last 22 years. Habit is a stubborn thing. Even after your marriage cracks, coffee still brews at the same time. Boots still wait by the front door. Life refuses to pause just because your heart does. The manufacturing plant smelled like machine oil, warm steel, and fresh-cut aluminum. Forklifts hummed through wide aisles while hydraulic presses thundered in the distance. Some people hear noise. I hear thousands of moving parts trusting one another not to fail. Morning, Ethan. Carlos, one of the maintenance supervisors, waved from across the floor. You look tired. Didn't sleep much. He laughed. Welcome to middle age. I smiled because it was easier than explaining the truth. The morning disappeared beneath work orders, preventive inspections, and emergency repairs. A failed hydraulic valve. A conveyor motor running hot. A robotic arm throwing calibration errors. Problems with solutions. I preferred those. People are harder to repair than machines. Just after lunch, my phone vibrated inside my jacket pocket. Unknown number. Normally, I ignored calls like that. Something made me answer. Mr. Walker? A calm woman's voice. This is Margaret Ellis from Hawthorne Industries Corporate Governance Office. For a second, I thought she'd dialed the wrong person. I'm sorry, I said. You probably meant to call my wife. No, sir. A brief pause followed. I specifically need to speak with Ethan Walker. I stopped walking. Around me, machines continued roaring as if nothing in the world had changed. I'm Ethan. Good. Another pause. The board of directors will be holding a special executive session Thursday morning. I frowned. I don't understand. You don't need to. Her voice remained perfectly composed. We simply require your attendance. My attendance for what? I'm afraid I can't discuss that over the phone. Silence settled between us. Then she added one sentence that made the entire factory suddenly feel very, very quiet. Mr. Walker, several members of the board have been waiting a long time to finally meet you in person. The most powerful secrets are never hidden behind locked doors. They're protected by ordinary assumptions. If everyone believes you're just a maintenance engineer, no one ever asks why the board of directors knows your name. For the rest of that afternoon, Margaret Ellis's phone call refused to leave my mind. I finished every repair order on my schedule because that's what I'd always done. A leaking hydraulic line didn't stop leaking because a stranger from corporate had called. A failed motor still needed replacing. Production targets didn't care about personal confusion. By 4 o'clock, the assembly line was running again. Carlos slapped me lightly on the shoulder. I swear, Ethan, one day they're going to clone you. I smiled. They'd probably return the clone after a week. He laughed and walked away. I watched the production line move with quiet precision. Thousands of parts flowed from one station to another, every worker trusting the person beside them to do their job. That's what a real system looked like. Nobody needed applause. They only needed reliability. Corporate offices often forgot that. Driving home, I kept replaying Margaret's final sentence. Several members of the board have been waiting a long time to finally meet you. Waiting? That implied they already knew who I was. The question was, why? Our house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees already beginning to lose their leaves. From the outside, it looked exactly like the life Olivia and I had spent 15 years building together. Inside, however, something had shifted. The lights in the kitchen were on. Olivia was already home. She sat at the island scrolling through emails on her tablet while a half-finished glass of white wine rested beside her. She didn't look up when I walked in. You're late. I had equipment to finish. Of course. The words weren't cruel. Just empty. I poured myself a glass of water and stood across from her. Neither of us mentioned the gala. Neither of us mentioned what she'd said. Sometimes silence becomes an agreement between two people who no longer know how to tell the truth. After several minutes, she finally spoke. We have a board meeting Thursday. I know. Her fingers stopped moving across the screen. You know? I received a call today. That caught her attention. She looked up for the first time. Who called you? Corporate governance. A tiny wrinkle formed between her eyebrows. They called you directly? Yes. What did they want? They said the board requested my attendance. She stared at me for several seconds before shaking her head. That doesn't make any sense. I was hoping you could explain it. I can't. Her answer came too quickly. The board doesn't invite maintenance engineers into executive sessions. I figured as much. She picked up her phone almost immediately, typing a message with surprising urgency. Then another. Then another. I recognized that expression. It wasn't curiosity. It was discomfort. Someone who believes they understand every piece on the chessboard becomes uneasy the moment one piece moves without permission. That evening passed with unusual quiet. Olivia spent nearly 3 hours in her home office making calls behind a closed door. Every time I walked past, her voice dropped lower. I didn't listen. Marriage had already lost enough respect. It didn't need me stealing what little privacy remained. Later that night, unable to sleep, I walked into the garage. Against the far wall stood an old steel cabinet covered in dust. Inside were boxes labeled by year. Project files. Engineering notebooks. Photographs. Most people collect souvenirs. I collected blueprints. I opened one weathered box and removed a thick binder stamped with a faded company logo. Hawthorne Industries. 15 years earlier. I ran my hand across the worn cover before opening it. Inside were hand-drawn production layouts, handwritten process calculations, equipment redesigns, and manufacturing models created long before the company became a billion-dollar corporation. Every page carried the same signature. Ethan Walker. Back then, Hawthorne wasn't an international manufacturer. It was one struggling facility with outdated equipment, shrinking contracts, and barely enough cash to survive another winter. Most people only knew the company after it became successful. Very few remembered the years when failure seemed inevitable. Fewer still remembered who stayed during those years. I closed the binder and slid it back into the cabinet. The past wasn't something I enjoyed revisiting. But Thursday had a way of pulling old memories toward the surface. As I switched off the garage light, my phone vibrated again. Another message from an unknown number. There were only 8 words. Please arrive 30 minutes early. The chairman insists. For the second time in 2 days, someone inside Hawthorne Industries had spoken to me as though I belonged somewhere I had spent years pretending I didn't. Thursday arrived with the kind of quiet certainty that makes ordinary mornings feel heavier than they should. I woke before the alarm, long before sunrise painted the horizon beyond our bedroom window. Olivia was already awake, sitting at the vanity in a charcoal business suit, fastening a pair of pearl earrings she only wore for board meetings. Neither of us mentioned the message I'd received. Neither of us mentioned the gala. Our marriage had become a place where silence carried more weight than conversation. I'll be leaving early, she said as she reached for her leather portfolio. So will I. She paused for the first time. For the plant? No. I buttoned my navy blazer. For downtown. She studied me in the mirror. I still don't understand why they asked you to come. I guess we'll both find out. Her expression remained unreadable, but something behind her eyes shifted. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was uncertainty, and uncertainty had never suited Olivia. She had built her career on always knowing the next move before everyone else. An hour later, my pickup rolled into the underground parking garage beneath Hawthorne Industries headquarters. Luxury sedans occupied nearly every reserved space. My truck looked painfully out of place among polished German imports and spotless electric SUVs. The security guard glanced at my visitor pass. Good morning, Mr. Walker. There was something different in his voice. Respect. Not because of who I was, but because someone upstairs had instructed him to expect me. Margaret Ellis was waiting in the main lobby exactly as she had promised. She was in her early 60s, dressed in a navy suit with silver-rimmed glasses and the calm posture of someone who had spent decades inside boardrooms where every word mattered. Mr. Walker. She extended her hand. Thank you for coming. I'll admit I'm still confused. I imagine you are. She offered a polite smile. Please follow me. Instead of leading me toward the executive elevators used by most senior officers, she guided me through a quieter corridor lined with framed photographs documenting Hawthorne's history. Factories under construction. Ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Old engineering teams standing proudly beside production equipment. Halfway down the hallway, I slowed. One photograph caught my attention. It had been taken nearly 15 years earlier. A much younger version of me stood beside a prototype assembly line, sleeves rolled up, holding a stack of blueprints while several engineers gathered around. There was no caption beneath the photograph. Only the year. Margaret noticed me looking. Interesting picture. It brings back memories. It should. She continued walking without offering another explanation. We reached a pair of walnut doors engraved with a simple brass plaque. Board conference room. She stopped before opening them. There's one thing you should know before we go inside. I looked at her. Only 6 people in this building are aware of the complete history surrounding today's meeting. I assume I'm one of them? You are. And Olivia? Margaret's eyes softened. No. The answer lingered between us. She believes today's meeting concerns executive restructuring. It doesn't. It concerns the future of Hawthorne Industries. Before I could ask another question, the doors opened. Inside, the long conference table stretched almost the length of the room. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago skyline while sunlight spilled across polished wood. Most of the directors were already seated. Several looked up the moment I entered. None of them appeared surprised to see me. In fact, more than one of them smiled as though greeting someone they had expected for years rather than days. At the head of the table sat an elderly gentleman with neatly combed white hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He rose before anyone else. Ethan. His voice carried warmth rather than ceremony. It's been far too long. I searched my memory. Then I recognized him. Richard Callaway. The man who had served as Hawthorne's chairman since before the company expanded nationwide. He crossed the room and shook my hand with both of his. I've been looking forward to this meeting, he said quietly. So have we all. Around the table, the remaining directors nodded in silent agreement. Only one chair remained empty. The one reserved for Olivia Walker. She still had no idea that she was about to walk into a meeting where everyone already knew a chapter of Hawthorne's history she had never been told. There are moments when a room changes before anyone says a word. You can feel it in the way people straighten their backs, exchange brief glances, or suddenly become interested in the papers lying in front of them. As I stood just inside the board conference room, I realized I had walked into one of those moments. Richard Callaway motioned toward the chair beside him. Please, Ethan. It wasn't the tone of a chairman addressing a guest. It was the tone of an old colleague welcoming someone back. I took my seat without asking questions. Around the table sat 9 directors, each with decades of experience leading companies worth billions of dollars. Some had built manufacturing empires. Others had guided international mergers or served on public boards across the country. Every one of them already knew my name. Richard folded his hands. I imagine you're wondering why you're here. I've been wondering since yesterday. A faint smile crossed his face. Fair enough. He looked around the table before continuing. Before today's formal session begins, there are a few matters of history that deserve to be acknowledged. History. Not strategy. Not quarterly earnings. History. One of the directors, an older woman named Susan Hartwell, opened a leather folder. 15 years ago, Hawthorne Industries was operating at a significant loss, she began. Our largest customer had terminated its contract. Equipment failures were becoming routine, and several investment groups advised us to liquidate. I remembered those days all too well. Machines breaking faster than we could repair them. Employees worried every Friday might be their last. Entire production lines held together by determination more than funding. Susan looked toward me. You submitted an operational redesign that reduced downtime by nearly 40% during the first year. I shrugged lightly. It was a team effort. Richard laughed softly. You've always answered that way. Another director spoke. The redesign didn't simply save production. He tapped a financial report. It bought this company enough time to survive. Silence settled over the room. I'd never thought of it that way. Back then, I wasn't trying to rescue a corporation. I was trying to help people keep their jobs. Men and women with mortgages. Parents raising children. Technicians who had spent their entire careers inside those factory walls. Numbers had never motivated me. People did. Richard leaned forward. Do you remember the proposal I made after the restructuring? I remember declining it. You turned down the executive position. I wasn't interested in titles. You also turned down stock options. I asked for something different. Several directors exchanged knowing smiles. Richard nodded. You did. His eyes remained fixed on mine. You asked that any long-term governance arrangement protect the company's culture before protecting executive compensation. I remembered every word. At the time, it had sounded idealistic. Maybe even naive. But I'd watched too many companies destroy themselves chasing quarterly numbers while forgetting the people who made those numbers possible. I wanted Hawthorne to stay a manufacturing company. Richard answered quietly. You wanted it to remember who built it. Before I could respond, the conference room doors opened again. Conversations stopped immediately. Olivia entered carrying her tablet and a folder of financial reports. She wore the same composed expression she always brought into executive meetings. Then she saw me. For the briefest instant, she froze. Her eyes shifted from me, to Richard, to the directors already seated around the table. Confusion replaced confidence. She recovered quickly, offering a professional smile. I wasn't aware Ethan would be attending. Richard gestured toward the remaining chair. Please, Olivia. She sat across from me. I noticed her glance toward Margaret Ellis, silently searching for an explanation. Margaret offered none. The room remained perfectly still. Richard waited until everyone had settled before speaking again. Now that we're all here, we can begin. He reached for a sealed envelope resting before him. Its heavy cream paper bore the embossed seal of Hawthorne Industries. I've delayed opening this document for nearly 15 years. Every eye in the room focused on the envelope. Including mine. Richard carefully broke the seal. He unfolded the single sheet inside. Then, before reading the first line, he looked directly at Olivia. What you're about to hear, he said calmly, is part of Hawthorne's founding agreement that has never been presented to the executive leadership team. The color slowly drained from Olivia's face as she realized she wasn't about to participate in an ordinary board meeting. She was about to discover that the company she had devoted her career to possessed a history she had never once been told. Some truths don't explode into a room. They unfold one page at a time. Richard Calloway lowered the document onto the polished conference table, but he didn't begin reading immediately. Instead, he looked around the room as though giving every director a final opportunity to reconsider what was about to happen. No one spoke. No one objected. Richard finally broke the silence. 15 years ago, when Hawthorne Industries was days away from defaulting on its debt, this board entered into a confidential governance agreement. Olivia's brow tightened. I've never seen that document. No, Richard replied evenly. You wouldn't have. He continued reading. The agreement recognized that extraordinary contributions to the survival of the company could not be measured solely through executive titles or stock ownership. The words sounded strangely formal, yet every sentence seemed to point in my direction. Richard looked up from the page. Ethan, do you remember why we insisted on drafting this? I remember telling you it wasn't necessary. A quiet laugh traveled around the table. Susan Hartwell smiled. You argued with us for almost 3 hours. I thought you were making too much of what I'd done. You still do, Richard answered. Olivia shifted in her chair. I'm sorry, but what exactly are we discussing? Richard folded the document. We're discussing the reason Hawthorne Industries still exists. The room became perfectly still. Olivia looked from one director to another, searching for someone who would tell her this was some elaborate misunderstanding. No one did. Richard nodded toward the wall-sized display. Margaret pressed a button on the remote. A series of photographs appeared on the screen. The first showed a nearly abandoned production floor. The second displayed broken assembly equipment. The third revealed engineers gathered around hand-drawn redesign plans. Then came another image. I recognized it immediately. It had been taken sometime after midnight during one of the longest weeks of my career. I stood beside 3 technicians, sleeves rolled up, holding a welding mask while we rebuilt an entire production line from salvaged equipment. Olivia stared at the screen. "I've never seen these." "Few people have," Susan replied. The company archives were sealed after the restructuring. The slideshow continued. Engineering sketches. Operational flowcharts. Cost reduction models. Maintenance schedules. Every page carried the same signature. Ethan Walker. Richard spoke again. Most executives believed Hawthorne required new investors. He paused. Ethan believed it required better systems. Another slide appeared. A graph illustrating production efficiency over 18 months. The numbers climbed steadily. Equipment failures declined. Revenue stabilized. Profit followed. "The turnaround began here," Richard said. "Not in the executive offices." He pointed toward the production charts. "On the factory floor." Olivia slowly lowered her tablet. For the first time since entering the room, she wasn't trying to analyze the meeting. She was trying to understand her husband. "I never knew," she whispered. I met her eyes. "I never talked about it." "Why not?" The answer came more easily than I expected. "Because the work mattered more than the credit." Silence settled over the room once again. Richard closed the historical presentation. "That attitude is precisely why today's meeting is necessary." He reached for another folder waiting beside him. Unlike the first, this one carried a bright red ribbon across the front. "History explains why we're here." He rested one hand on the folder. "This explains what happens next." Several directors instinctively straightened in their chairs. Margaret distributed identical packets to everyone except me. Olivia glanced at the title printed across the cover. Special Board Resolution. Her breathing became noticeably slower. "What resolution?" she asked. Richard answered without hesitation. "The future leadership of Hawthorne Industries." A murmur moved around the table as directors opened their packets. Olivia turned the first page. Her eyes scanned the opening paragraphs. Then she stopped. Color drained from her face. She looked up at Richard. "There has to be a mistake." "There isn't." She turned another page, then another, reading faster each time. Finally, her gaze lifted toward me. Not with anger. Not with resentment. With complete disbelief. Because for the first time since we'd met, she had discovered that the man she'd dismissed as a blue-collar nobody had never been standing outside the company's story. He had been part of its foundation all along. And the next vote would determine whether that forgotten foundation was about to become its future. The difference between a decision and a verdict is simple. A decision considers the future. A verdict explains the past. As I watched Olivia stare at the resolution in front of her, I realized the board was about to deliver both. She turned another page. Her hands, usually steady during shareholder presentations and earnings calls, hesitated for the first time since I'd known her. "This," she whispered. "This can't be right." Richard Calloway remained calm. "It has been reviewed by our legal counsel, our governance committee, and every director present." Olivia looked around the table. "No one mentioned this." Susan Hartwell answered gently. "Because none of us were permitted to." Richard folded his hands. The confidential agreement was designed to activate only under extraordinary circumstances. What circumstances? The retirement of the sitting chief executive officer. The room fell silent again. I finally understood why the directors had looked at me the way they had. This meeting had never been about history alone. It had always been about succession. Richard stood and walked toward the windows overlooking Chicago. For 22 years, I've had the privilege of serving this company. He smiled faintly. I've also reached an age where leadership means knowing when someone else should take the wheel. He turned back toward us. My retirement becomes effective today. Several directors nodded respectfully. Olivia lowered her eyes to the resolution once more. The recommendation, she said quietly. Her voice almost disappeared. It names Ethan. No one corrected her. No one looked surprised. Richard returned to his seat. It does. She looked directly at me. You never told me. I wasn't allowed to. And even if I had been, I continued, I never asked for it. That much was true. 15 years earlier, I had refused executive titles because I believed my work belonged on the factory floor. Over time, life had carried us in different directions. Olivia climbed through the executive ranks. I stayed where machines, people, and production problems kept me honest. Neither of us imagined those separate paths would eventually meet again. Richard addressed the board. As required under Article 7, the recommendation must now be confirmed by formal vote. Margaret Ellis distributed electronic voting tablets. The atmosphere shifted. This was no longer a conversation. It was governance. One by one, directors reviewed the resolution. No speeches. No debates. They had already spent months discussing the company's future. Today was simply the day the decision became official. Richard looked toward me. Ethan, company policy requires that nominees leave the room during voting. I nodded. Of course. I rose from my chair. As I reached the door, Olivia spoke softly. Ethan. I turned. She searched for the right words. None came. For the first time since our marriage began, the woman who always had the perfect presentation, the perfect answer, and the perfect strategy found herself completely unprepared. I offered a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't resentment. It was patience. Then I stepped into the hallway. The heavy doors closed behind me. Outside, everything felt strangely ordinary. Employees walked past carrying laptops and coffee. Phones rang. Elevators opened and closed. Somewhere below, thousands of people continued building products, completely unaware that the future leadership of the company was being decided one floor above them. Margaret joined me a few moments later. They may take a while. I've waited 15 years. I suppose another few minutes won't matter. She smiled. You know, Mr. Walker. Ethan. She corrected herself warmly. Most people spend their careers trying to convince others they're leaders. She paused. You spent yours trying to avoid the title. I've always believed leadership isn't a position. What is it? It's the responsibility people give you after they've watched you solve problems for a very long time. She considered that answer. I think the board would agree. Before I could respond, the conference room doors opened. Richard stepped into the hallway. His expression revealed nothing. Only when he reached me did he extend his hand. It is finished. I shook it. Was it unanimous? A slow smile spread across his face. There are some moments in a company's history, he said quietly, when every person in the room understands exactly what must be done. He opened the doors wider. The board would like to welcome you back. As I crossed the threshold once more, every director in the room rose to their feet. Only one person remained seated. Olivia. She wasn't refusing to stand. She simply couldn't. She was still trying to reconcile two completely different versions of the man she thought she had known, the maintenance engineer she had underestimated, and the leader the board had just chosen to guide the company into its next chapter. Power has an unusual way of revealing character. Some people use it to settle old scores. Others use it to protect people who never expected to need protecting. As every director remained standing around the conference table, I understood that the next words I spoke would define me far more than the title they had just offered. Richard Calloway gestured toward the chair at the head of the table. It belongs to you now. For a brief moment, I simply looked at it. The leather chair seemed no different from the others. It wasn't the furniture that carried weight. It was every decision that would eventually be made from it. I walked to the head of the table but didn't sit down immediately. Instead, I rested one hand on the back of the chair. I appreciate the confidence you've placed in me, I said. But before we discuss the future, I'd like to address something else. Every director listened. Including Olivia. I turned toward her. She hadn't spoken since the vote. The confidence that had always surrounded her had been replaced by quiet reflection. She looked less like a senior executive and more like someone trying to understand how years of certainty could disappear in a single morning. I know what happened at the gala, Richard said carefully. Several members of the board were informed. Olivia closed her eyes for a moment. Embarrassment spread across her face. I was wrong. The words were barely audible. No one interrupted. She continued. I judged you by your job title. Her voice trembled. I thought I understood success. She finally looked directly at me. I never asked who you were before I met you. I answered honestly. I never felt the need to explain. Maybe you should have. Maybe. The room remained silent. Richard watched us without interfering. This wasn't a governance issue anymore. It was something no board could resolve. Olivia took a slow breath. When I said you would never be more than a blue-collar nobody. She stopped, unable to finish. I remember. I wish I could take those words back. I nodded. I believe you. Her eyes widened slightly. You do? I do. She looked genuinely surprised. Why? Because regret sounds different from fear. No one moved. No one reached for a document. For several seconds, the conference room became nothing more than two people confronting the distance that had slowly grown between them. I finally took my seat. Not because I wanted to demonstrate authority. Because it was time to begin working. I looked around the table. I accepted this responsibility for one reason. The directors waited. Hawthorne was built by people whose names never appeared in annual reports. I thought about the technicians on the factory floor. The welders. The electricians. The machine operators. The maintenance crews who arrived before sunrise and left long after sunset. They deserve leadership that remembers where this company began. Several directors nodded. Susan smiled quietly. Richard leaned back with visible satisfaction. I had hoped you'd say something like that. I opened the folder containing the transition documents. My first decision is simple. Everyone focused on me. We will begin a company-wide operational review. Olivia glanced up. Cost reductions? No. I shook my head. Conversations. She looked puzzled. I want to visit every facility. Every director remained silent. I want to meet every production team. I continued. I want to hear directly from the people who solve problems every day. Richard laughed softly. You really are the same man who walked into our factory 15 years ago. I hope so. Because if leadership changes who you are, it probably found the wrong person. As the meeting concluded, directors slowly gathered their papers. One by one, they congratulated me before leaving the room. Eventually only 3 people remained. Richard, Olivia, and me. Richard checked his watch. I'll leave the 2 of you alone. He quietly stepped outside, closing the doors behind him. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. I don't know where we go from here. I answered truthfully. I don't either. Another long pause. But I do know this. She looked up. I'm not interested in humiliating anyone. I remembered the gala. The laughter. The applause that followed her words. I won't repay public embarrassment with public revenge. A tear slowly escaped the corner of her eye. You've every reason to. Maybe. I stood and picked up my folder. But building something has always mattered more to me than breaking something. As I walked toward the door, I paused beside her chair. We both have difficult conversations ahead. She nodded without speaking. I opened the conference room doors. Outside, employees hurried through the corridors, completely unaware that Hawthorne Industries had a new chief executive, or that the first decision he made after becoming CEO had nothing to do with power, and everything to do with choosing dignity over revenge. Success has a strange way of changing the questions people ask. They stop wondering whether you'll make it. Instead, they wonder what kind of person you'll become after you do. 6 months passed faster than I expected. The title on my office door had changed. My routine had not. Most mornings still began before sunrise. I still walked the factory floors before attending executive meetings. I still carried a notebook instead of relying on presentations. The only real difference was that more people now stopped to shake my hand along the way. The company had changed too. Production delays had fallen. Employee turnover reached its lowest level in nearly a decade. More importantly, people smiled again. They believed someone in the executive offices actually understood what happened beyond the conference rooms. Richard Calloway officially retired that spring. Before leaving, he stopped by my office one final time. I was hoping the chair would change you, he said with a grin. I looked up from a maintenance report. It didn't. I know. He laughed. It changed the company instead. After he left, I stood by the window overlooking the manufacturing campus. Thousands of people moved between buildings. Forklifts crossed loading docks. Machines continued doing exactly what they had done long before I arrived and would continue doing long after I was gone. Leadership had never really been about being the most important person in the building. It was about making sure everyone else could do their best work. Olivia and I also changed. Not overnight. Some things can't be repaired with a single apology. Trust returns quietly. One honest conversation at a time. She resigned from her executive position several weeks after the board meeting. It wasn't because anyone forced her to. No one did. She simply believed the company deserved a fresh beginning, free from unnecessary questions about conflicts of interest. Later, she accepted a leadership role at a nonprofit organization that helped train young professionals entering manufacturing careers. Ironically, she found herself encouraging people whose jobs looked very much like the one she had once dismissed. One evening we met for coffee after work. No boardrooms. No speeches. No reporters. Just two people trying to become better than the versions of themselves who had hurt each other. I've spent months thinking about that night at the gala, she admitted. So have I. I keep asking myself why I said those words. I stirred my coffee. Have you found an answer? She nodded slowly. I confused position with value. She smiled sadly. I thought success made people important. And now? I think character does. For the first time in a long while, the silence between us felt peaceful rather than heavy. When we stood to leave, she looked at me with quiet sincerity. Thank you. For what? For refusing to become the person I deserved. I understood what she meant. Anyone can use victory as a weapon. It takes far more strength to use it as an opportunity to end a cycle. As I drove home that evening, I passed the old service entrance where I had parked my pickup for years. The security guard waved. I waved back. Some habits are worth keeping. People occasionally ask whether becoming CEO was the greatest moment of my life. They're always surprised by my answer. It wasn't. The greatest moment came much earlier. It happened 15 years before the board ever voted. It happened when a struggling company needed someone willing to solve problems without asking who would receive the credit. Everything that followed, the promotions, the recognition, even the title, grew from that single decision. Because careers are built by talent. Reputations are built by consistency. But legacies are built by the choices nobody sees. If there's one lesson my journey taught me, it's this: never measure another person's future by the uniform they're wearing today. The mechanic fixing a machine. The technician working the night shift. The quiet employee no one notices in the corner of the room. Any one of them may already possess the wisdom, integrity, and courage to lead. Titles can be awarded in a single afternoon. Character is earned one ordinary day at a time. And sometimes, the person the world calls a nobody has been quietly becoming exactly the leader everyone will eventually need.